Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to another episode of the 80s ADHD Guy with Ben Glenn. That is me, and this is where this guy from the 80s, who grew up in the 80s, kind of unpacks all things ADHD. And in that first episode, I kind of went over my story and kind of concluded with me entering into high school. So I thought I'd kind of pick up from there. And then I had some things that I wanted to kind of touch on, more of like, what is ADHD? You know? So let me go ahead and continue with the story though. Had 3 really, really hard years in middle school. And there's an interesting story there. I had a teacher who was the special ed teacher. And this is back in the time before they started learning about inclusion classes, where you would have a student who would have an IEP or a 504 plan and or a 504 designation, and they would now leave them in the mainstream level classroom. So, you know, there's this kid intermingled with the other, let's say 20, 30 students, and then you have an additional teacher. So you've got the main teacher, then you have an additional teacher, and that teacher knows which students potentially are going to need more accommodations. And then also they get accommodations with testing time and different things like that. And I know all this because my daughter, who is my clone, Annie, she has a 504 and an IEP, and she's been very successful with that. But that's how they did that in elementary and middle school. And so that's not what they did in the 80s. Back in the 80s, they didn't know as much as they know now. So they would throw you in this small, teeny tiny little classroom about the size of a storage closet, and you would have one specific teacher, and her job was to help navigate and to educate those individuals that had different learning styles, those that had neurological challenges, you know. And so it was difficult in middle school because the special ed teacher who had been there for years, apparently, who I'd never met, retired or moved or got a different job. She was gone. And they were kind of like, oh crap, we've got a handful of students. I believe at that time we had maybe a dozen, probably less than that. I can remember when I was there were only like 3 or 4 students. But then as you kind of get to know everybody, and you have like your little, I don't know what they call it, like a teacher parent conference or whatever, you find out, oh wait, there's more people in there at different times of the day that you know, I'm not aware of. So as a 6th grader, I would be in there with 6th and 7th graders, and then there'd be later on in the day where you'd have 8th graders and 7th graders. And then it really matters. But at the end of the day, there were a handful of us, one teacher, and this teacher was not educated in all things special ed. She was a classically trained teacher, to come to find out, and she was thrown into the special ed classroom because they needed somebody. She needed a job. She was this young teacher right out of college, and she didn't know how to, I guess, she didn't know how to teach us, really. And so this teacher started using common sense. You know, if you've got students that don't pay attention, well, common sense says do this. And she would approach us in a way that was not very effective. And a lot of times she'd get frustrated. And when you get frustrated, sometimes you say things that you don't really, well, you shouldn't say. You may think them, but you shouldn't say them, especially to middle school students. And so it became a very abusive, very discouraging 3 years. And I think that any work that got done in elementary school with Mr. Boovy, who I talked about in the previous podcast, was now being just slowly wiped away. Any confidence, any kind of excitement, any kind of inspiration that he had brought with his style and his accommodations was just getting wiped away. And I had really 3 very, very difficult years. And plus, it's middle school. What do we know about middle school? Well, that's when boys become slowly become men, young adults, and the body's changing, and girls no longer have cooties, and you're trying to figure out where you fit in, and some boys are growing faster than others, and some have hair and some don't, and you're like, whoa, where do I fit into this mix? And it's interesting, having been at the church for 3 years, I mentioned that in the first podcast, that when the COVID year came around, and it wasn't because of COVID that I decided to apply for this job. It was basically a friend asking me to come alongside a young youth pastor and help him out and mentor him. And it was a great opportunity for me to bring my daughters into an engaging situation where they could develop community, something very difficult for kids who have parents who are on stage. And typically they're back in the green room or they're behind the scenes with dad and mom. And if you want your kids to get a feel for community and conversation and engagement, they got to get out there with the young people. So that was the motivation. And COVID hit and things kind of worked out to where I was there for 3 years. And part of my duties was working with middle school students, and they are a squirrely bunch. It takes a very special individual to want to work with them. And I did. I really enjoyed it. They are just goofy, but they're still not so guarded, where you can have great conversations if you can peel back some of the layers, and you can be a part of a really important time in their life, because so much development is happening during that time. In fact, I remember when my daughter Annie started middle school, we were invited to one of those, hey, all parents come in and meet the principal and everything. Actually, this was with Natasha, my oldest daughter. And the principal got up and said something that I hadn't thought about. He said, in the next 3 years, your kids are going to change and develop more than ever before in their life, except for the from 0 to 3. This is the second most changing you're going to see from them physically, mentally, all of the above. And they're not wrong. And so it takes a special person to say, hey, I'm going to be a part of that goofiness. And this teacher that I had in middle school, we were basically given her because the school was out of options. She was out of options. She needed a job, and this should have been the job. And it was very, very challenging. So by the time I got to high school, I was pretty beat up. You know, I talk a lot about emotional walls. We all go through stuff in life, and some things for people are more than others. You know, some are more tragic, more drastic than others, and why that is, I don't know. But I do know that the struggling and the suffering and the challenges, they do have the opportunity to mold us and to shape us and to strengthen us, if we approach it that way. And to be able to approach a struggle and a challenge with the attitude of, hey, I'm going to make this thing work for me versus defeat me, is something that actually needs to be taught. Somebody needs to come alongside an individual who is going through something difficult and say, hey, you may have never known this. Nobody's ever maybe showed you this, but this thing can actually make you stronger and better. But it really depends upon your attitude. It depends upon how you approach it. And if you don't have somebody teaching you that, then these things are just going to continue to kick your butt. And what we end up with is a bunch of worry, a bunch of anxiety, a bunch of kids that are really good at stinking thinking. We got kids that are dealing with depression. You got kids that are confused about their sexuality, because they're trying to find their place. They're trying to find that happy place. They're trying to find where they fit in and where they belong. So a lot of times you have kids and they're just going to try everything because something's got to stick, right? So by the time I was in high school, I was a wreck, an emotional wreck. And the funny thing about those emotional walls that we built, so visualize this for a minute. Through the pain and the hurt that you experience in life, you build emotional walls. And these walls serve a purpose. And that purpose is to keep people out. Now, that wall does not differentiate between people that want to help you and people that want to hurt you. It serves one purpose, just keep everyone out. And so you begin to isolate. And I've shared this, and if you've heard me speak, you've probably heard me mention this. The Discovery Channel can teach us some amazing things. If you ever watch the Discovery Channel and you see the predator chasing the prey, which one usually gets eaten first? It's that one deer, that one Bambi that is isolating, that one that's by itself, that stepped away from the group, that stepped away from the pack. And we can learn from that as we watch our kids. Which ones do we need to be more mindful of? Not the ones that are in community, not the ones that are engaged, not the ones that are battling together. It's those ones that go and sit by themselves and have no friends and are isolating and stuck with their stinking thinking. And they look normal. They look like any normal middle school kid, but on the inside, they are an absolute wreck. I shared this with one of my leaders, one of these individuals that I'm mentoring right now. One of the things that I love about Lego is that they've got incredible marketing. I mean, they put a magazine out every 3 months on new sets that they have coming out, and they do just a masterful job of making you want that set. And what you don't realize is that, hey, what you're looking at is potential. Because when you bring that set home and you open up the box and you pour it all out, it's all broken. It's in just incredible pieces. It's got to be put together, and that takes time, and it's a process, and there's, steps on how you do it. There's structure, all of those things. But what you're dealing with is really good marketing with a lot of brokenness on the inside, and that's these kids. They all have great potential. And because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, they're going to put out a really good marketing campaign. And that's what I did. I mean, somebody came up to me and asked me, "Hey man, how you doing? How you doing?" I give them the token answer. I'm doing good. But on the inside, I'm struggling. I'm trying to figure things out. And this teacher did a horrendous job. And I won't get into the verbal abuse, but it was ample. Enough to where I still remember it at 50. I remember the things that were said and done. Okay. And there was no physical abuse or anything like that. But as we know, words are very powerful. I mean, I've said this and I'll say it again. When you open up the first book in the Bible, Genesis, it literally says God spoke the world into existence. God said, "Let there be light." Bam, there's light. That's how powerful words are. And if you think about just that right there, if you just pause for a minute and you think about how powerful words are, when you're dropping out those negative, stinking thinking words to somebody, or even worse, to yourself, they have power. They do damage. So by the time I was in the middle school or high school, after middle school, my emotional wall was pretty thick, pretty high, and I was slowly becoming an isolator. The only real activity that I had was basketball. I was a big kid. I had an older brother who was a star basketball player. I think he was the first guy ever in Plainfield to slam dunk a ball in a game, no less. And so Sam Glenn was becoming really well known, and I was this stocky, not quite as tall as my brothers. I'm the runt of my family. I'm still 6'4", but I'm the runt. Had some gravitational issues. Apparently, I'm big boned. I think I dunked the ball maybe a half a dozen times in college. I did get a basketball scholarship, and that's a fun story that I'll share at some point in one of these pods. But they had one hoop that the rim was kind of bent a little bit, and I could dunk on that one. And it wasn't like a big bent, but it was just enough that I could just get the ball over top of it, and yay. I think I even still have a picture of it. I look at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, look how skinny I was. Anyway, basketball was my only community and my only connection. But other than that, it was maybe just one neighborhood kid back home that I would hang out with, and he was a little bit goofy like me, and so that was it. And so I was left alone a lot to just combat my incredible stinking thinking. And one of the things that I believe is a blessing, but can be a curse if we think about, hey, everything that comes along with ADHD, if you kind of spin it with a silver lining, there is a benefit there. There is a potentially good aspect and quality there. And one of the qualities that ADHD individuals have is typically a very good imagination and are very creative. I've made a career out of that. If you Google Ben Glenn, you're going to see me standing on stage, drawing these huge pictures. And so I've done this where I've taken my struggle and I've turned it into something that is profitable and also really fun. So when you're a creative person and you use that creativity for evil, and you're left alone, what you're doing is you're finding really creative and horrific ways to put yourself down. And so when I was in ninth grade, I was struggling so much with all of that internal turmoil that I was having to go to doctor's visits, and I was sick, and nobody really knew what was going on. There was nothing really definitive. And I can remember my mom finally bringing me to a Chinese doctor. I don't know, like an internalist, and it was a very unique, very much like out of a movie thing. And it got to that point where it was like, we got to just try anything. And he was the only one that said, hey, this kid has got way too much going on inside of his mind, and it's not good. He needs to get that stuff out. And so, and basketball did help with that. I mean, sports are really good for helping to deal with that internal rat race of a mind. I actually highlighted this. I got some notes, and I highlighted this. This is a great quote from Dr. Edward M. Hallowell. I love Dr. Hallowell. He is so good. He has written a ton of books. He's written one of my favorite books, Driven to Distractions. I'm actually in the middle of reading his new book, who he co-authored with John Rady, which is called ADHD 2.0, just trying to update my knowledge on what's going on out there. But this is what he says: having ADHD means my mind is a Ferrari engine, but with bicycle brakes. And he's not wrong. And so think about that Ferrari engine feeding it negativity, not being able to slow it down because you have bicycle brakes. And you're absorbing all of that. And that was me, my freshman year in high school. And it took a really special teacher to come into that situation and to snap me out of it. And that's where I don't know who you are, and I don't know all the people that are listening to this, how you found this. But if you're an adult and you are in a position where you have the honor and blessing to pour into young people, listen to this. They need you. Young people need adults that say, hey, I'm going to carve out time to invest, to teach, to mentor, sometimes to, give a swift kick. And here's the interesting thing. And parents that are listening to this, you probably are starting to figure this out. At some point, your kids are not going to listen to you fully. They may obey you, but there is this time where your kids are going to be thinking, mom and dad, they don't know, they don't know that much. And they may not fully embrace your encouragement, your direction, your guidance. Great example. Back in 2000, I want to say 2008, 2007, I started boxing. It was my wife's idea. I was struggling with becoming the chunky chalk guy. And I couldn't play basketball anymore. I got some really horrific knees and ankles. And so my wife is just like, hey, why don't you try boxing? And I'm like, hey, isn't that the sport where they punch you in the face? This is the money maker. She's like, yeah, but it's a really good sport. And as far as neurological benefits, apparently boxing is top shelf. If you've ever heard of Rocksteady Boxing, it is a boxing program for individuals with Parkinson's disease, which is a neurological brain disorder that helps to combat the symptoms of Parkinson's. And it's clinically proven. And so, you start putting some things together here. Oh, wait, there is a sport. Now, you don't necessarily have to train to get into the ring, but if you train like a boxer, it will have neurological benefits. In fact, John Rady, the co-author of the book that I'd mentioned earlier, ADHD 2.0, wrote a book years ago called Spark. I read half of it. I'm a half a book reader. I'm working on it. I'm getting better. I actually just recently finished a whole book, had a little, party. Because, when you achieve and accomplish different things, even little things, you got to celebrate. You got to do that. And so, but he wrote a book called Spark, and that book was all about the neurological benefits from cardiovascular working out. And so you think about boxing, and my wife, she knew this. She's just like, well, he's not going to get any benefit from a treadmill or from an elliptical because he's just going to get bored. She's not wrong. Put him in the ring, put him in a boxing situation where he actually gets to hit something, well, he might actually, enjoy this. And she was spot on. I fell in love with it. And I had an amazing coach, Coach Hank Johnson. A shout out to Coach Hank Johnson. He is in the Boxing Hall of Fame. He was Coach of the Year 1988 for the Olympics. His brother was the two-time light heavyweight champion of the world, Marvin Johnson. Coach Hank has trained many champions. He had retired, and when I met him, he was just coming out of retirement. He was getting back into boxing, and somehow we found each other. He lives in Indiana, and I fell in love, and we would work out every day. And eventually it got to the point where he's just like, hey, my son is showing some interest, and his son Dubois was maybe 15 at the time. And so Coach Dubois and I would work out together, and Coach would try to coach his son. And his son wouldn't listen. And finally, Coach learned something, or he knew this, and I didn't know it because I wasn't my kids were really little at the time. He knew that there were certain things that if he wanted his son to absorb them and to implement them, that instruction needed to come from an outside source. It needed to come from somebody who was like-minded and would encourage his son in the same way he would, but it had to come from an outside source. And so Coach would pull me aside, and he would say, hey, when you're in there working with Dubois, tell him to do this. Encourage him to try this. And it worked. It absolutely worked. And I can remember the first time I started, connecting those dots and why Coach was having me do that. I'm driving home, and I was scratching my head in confusion, like, oh my gosh, your dad is in the Hall of Fame. Your dad literally wears a ring that says Coach of the Year 1988 Olympics. Like, your dad knows a lot about this sport. And yet for some reason, because he's your dad, you're not willing to fully listen to him. And so we who are adults and have the capacity to pour into young people, that means, hey, if you want to this is a great thing. If you want to volunteer at your church in the youth group, I guarantee you that youth pastor will embrace you with open arms. And it does not matter how young or old you are. Just be available. I always try to recruit the older people, because you guys that are a little bit older listening to this, you have experience. You have wisdom. I had a handful of older leaders when I worked at the church, but I had a bunch of young 20-something-year-olds. And they were great because they always showed up, but yet they still hadn't learned a lot of things in life because they were 20. So I want to challenge you, if you're listening to this, you can have an incredible impact on a young person's life. And if you look at the state of our country and just the chaos and the confusion and the pandemonium of where things are going and where things are projected to go, especially with our young people, how they are struggling with communication and connecting. And, we've got our devices, and that's a huge contributor of that. But the way we combat that is by getting involved, being very intentional in making ourselves available to pour into young people, to teach them. You can't do something that nobody's ever showed you how to do. And so when we talk about community and connection and engagement, they already stink and struggle with that. COVID made it worse. There's this incredible atrophy. And even some of you adults that are listening to this are struggling with that. Yeah, it's easier to shoot off a text. It's easier to, send off an email. And yeah, technology is great. And in some cases, yeah, that's good. But the reality of it is that sometimes you just need to get on the phone and hear somebody's voice. Sometimes you need to carve out the time to sit down and have a cup of coffee because you are connecting in person. And our kids need that. So they need to be taught that. So I know I kind of went in a tangent, but that's what this podcast is all about. I mean, you're getting it from the 80s ADHD guy, which means it's going to be all over the place. And so my hero, aside from my mom, because she had to endure me every day, and we'll talk more about her later, was my freshman year special ed teacher, Mrs. Thielberg. We used to call her Mrs. T. And if she's listening to this, thank you again. She knows how grateful I am. I had a chance. I lost touch with her. I only had her for a year. That even shows you how much impact a person can have in just even a short time. I look back and I think, man, what if I would have had her for all 4 years of high school? Where would I be today? But having her positive influence and her incredible encouragement, and also her I'm not going to take your crap mentality, and she didn't take my crap at all, and I could dish out that crap. She really was the difference. She helped to wipe away the incredible damage that I had experienced during 3 years in middle school, kind of reboot the system, break me down to nothing, and then redesign me back up into a student who felt like there was possibility and potential. And so I owe her everything. And I really do believe that God orchestrated it, that she would be my teacher. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It took a few months before she kind of lost her cool with me because I was isolating and I was not a very good student. And, what makes a good student? That's a really good question. You ever ask yourself, what makes a good student a good student? Sometimes you walk into a school, and I've done hundreds of thousands of school assemblies, and I still do them. They are the toughest speaking gig you could ever get, especially more now than ever because kids, they're not as verbally responsive. Back in the early 2000s, and I get up and I do some school assemblies. I mean, it was like Comedy Central. And I get with the middle school kids, and it was like off the hook, crazy funny. And kids would come up to me and they would say, I've never laughed that hard. I had one kid, he came up to me and was like, I laughed so hard that my side of my stomach hurt so bad. And then I had another kid that come up to me and said, I laughed so hard I peed a little. And you're having a good time if somebody says, I peed a little. And so she had left, and I was doing a school assembly at this school, and I had no idea where she was at. This was before Facebook and all that stuff. I think MySpace had just come out. And I was in the auditorium, I was setting up, and I looked up and I knew who she was right away. And I ran at her and I gave her this huge hug. And I'm pretty sure she was freaking out. And I finally had the opportunity to say thank you for not giving up on me. It was a few months into the school year where she just came over to me and she said, snap out of it. Up to that point, I was not a good student, and to answer the question, I didn't answer it. I got a little distracted with the comedy thing, but what makes a good student a good student? It's not a student that just sits there quiet. In fact, there are 3 types of ADHD. I got them even highlighted right here. All right, you guys ready for this? Because this is kind of important. There are 3 types of ADHD. You got the primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive impulse, and then you have the combined. So those are the 3 types. But that first one, inattentive, that's a lot of girls fall under that category, and they don't get diagnosed till later on because they look like they're just really good students. That kid that's just sitting there and not raising their hand, and they're facing forward, and they're not making noises, and they're not distracting anyone around them. Well, that's a really good student. No, they're an easy student. There's a difference there. A good student is a student who raises their hand and engages, who asks questions, who gets involved, and sometimes is even a little bit disruptive. And if you love your job and you're a teacher, you want to have a good student. You want a student who is going to engage and make things just full of energy and makes it exciting. And Mrs. Thielberg was a great teacher, and I was robbing her from the opportunity to do what she loves because I was this very isolated, inattentive ADHD kid who was very broken and afraid. That's the other side. I was super afraid. I don't want to raise my hand. What if I was wrong? I can remember one time in middle school in the special ed classroom, I raised my hand and I gave my answer and it was wrong. And oh my gosh, my special ed teacher blasted me with this narrative of stupidity. I can't believe what a stupid answer. That's exactly what a stupid answer. Well, thank you for that word of encouragement. So maybe it was like 2 or 3 months into the school year, she came over and told me to snap out of it. And she began to pour into me relentlessly. That was the one thing. If you were to say, hey, Ben, what was the one difference between Mrs. Thielberg and all the other teachers you had? She was relentless. She just wouldn't stop. She was always just like, cheering us on, trying to keep us encouraged, yelling at us when we needed it. She just always wanted the best out of us. And she pushed us. And that was a huge factor. I think that sometimes, especially now more than ever, and this is the 80s coming out right now, we are afraid that we're going to break our kids. This mental health thing has become so, I don't know. I can't think of the word. It's so much mental health, anxiety. And you start hearing about individuals who've committed suicide. And that is, to me, the most horrific, most terrifying thing. I can remember getting booked to do suicide awareness weeks. And then on top of that, I started getting booked to do this suicide survivor event. And these are by far the most difficult shows I've ever done in my 30 years. Most difficult. Because one, they're secular, so I can't bring my faith into it. And I don't know how you get through something like that without some faith. And so we get really worried that we're going to break our kids. And so we have created things in a very kind of a soft, I feel like, bubble. And what you really need is a balance. There still needs to be a struggle. We still need to push our students. And Mrs. Thielberg, she had a really perfect balance. She would push you and she would, she wouldn't yell, but she would just get all, energetic. And in the same narrative, she would build you up. She would say, hey, you're not going to give me an excuse. You're going to do this, and I believe you can do this, and you got what it takes, da-da-da-da. So she would not take our crap, but then she would push us and inspire us to do the thing that she asked us to do. So she didn't take away the struggle. We still had to do it. Where today, it's just like, okay, well, let's make it a little bit easier. We don't want you to have any anxiety. We don't want you to have, a panic attack. And all that stuff is real. I get it. Hear me. I get that. I'm not over here making fun of it. What I'm saying, though, is that we can't go so far this side of the soft approach that we don't let these kids struggle. And that's something that if you're from the 80s and you have ADHD, first of all, you probably got diagnosed later on. And back in the 3rd grade when they labeled me with all this stuff, they didn't label me ADHD. I got labeled LD, learning disabled, dyslexic, all these other letters, stunk with reading comprehension. What they noticed what was a product of ADHD, but what they were recognizing were the academic issues. The ADHD thing came later. After they learned more and more about, oh, wait, these things are kind of connected. Dyslexia and ADHD are kind of connected. So if you grew up in the 80s and you were in the special ed program, you probably know, hey, it wasn't easy. You had to figure out how to survive. And yet you did. And because you survived, you were able to then grow from that and learn from that. So a lot of you guys that are adults that have ADHD, maybe, you grew up in the 80s and they didn't even diagnose you. And what probably happened was you were in school, or excuse me, your kids were in school, and your kids were showing signs of something that has become very well known. In fact, it even says here, ADHD is one of the most common childhood disorders and continues through can continue through adolescence and adulthood. I highlighted that, but basically, my point is that it's very common. And so if you've got a young person, if you got a child who may be a teacher, maybe you're recognizing some things where they're like, hey, yeah, maybe your kid might be ADHD, or you've heard enough to where you're like, we might, they're struggling. And so you go and you get your child tested. And I would recommend, if you are somebody who's in that stage right now, like, I don't know, should I get them tested? Should I not get them tested? I'm always going to lean on the side, hey, it's better safe than sorry to just go get the test. And I'll tell you why. You can't figure out how to combat something until you identify what that something is. There is a fear of, I don't want to label, and I don't want to, have to navigate the emotional trauma from a label and all that crap. But at the end of the day, if they have ADHD, it'll be really nice to know. And they're not alone. There are a lot of us out there now, and there's a lot of resources. Here you go. The 80s ADHD guy, Ben Glenn. It's a resource. But some of you that are listening to this, you brought your child and you had them tested, and as they went through that test, you were like, oh crap, I think I might have this as well. And yet somehow you made it through. And the reason why you made it through is because you figured out how to struggle and to create accommodations and figure out how to get things done. Going back to, I don't know if it was, it was in the first podcast. I talked about how I became a cheater. And you can say, oh, you're a cheater, you're dishonest and all that. You're going straight to hell for that one, man. No, what I learned was how to survive. There's a difference there. I learned how to make it. And so back in the 80s, when you grew up in the special ed program, you had to suffer a little bit differently than you do now. It wasn't nearly as easy. And for these kids, they don't know any better, so for them, it doesn't feel easy. But when you compare the two, and I'm not saying that you should, but when you do, you're like, no, you got it pretty darn easy. So we need to figure out a way to come alongside our young people, encourage them, invest in them, but also find that balance of, hey, I need to inspire them, but I also need to let them struggle, because it's through that struggle they are going to grow. They're going to develop skills that they will need later on in life. The reality of it is that, and I told my daughter this, they don't give you accommodations in the real world. They don't. When you go to Target during the holidays and you have a hard time standing in line because of your Ferrari brain, and you're getting frustrated and you're getting exasperated and you're about ready to just have an impulsive moment, nobody at Target, the manager's not going to run over and pick you out of the line saying, you know what? I heard back in school you had a 504 plan and you were designated 504 and you have an IEP plan. We're going to go ahead and open up a separate line for you so that you don't have an impulsive moment. No, they're not going to do that. What's going to happen is you're going to stand in that line and you're going to get really frustrated and hopefully not do something stupid like I have done. We got a few more minutes left in this podcast, and I just want to touch on a few things. I didn't even get into my second episode. I actually have it listed right here, Understanding ADHD. So we're going to bump that to the third episode, but we got through most of my story. I'll just kind of wrap that up. The high school years, they were foundational because of a single adult who said, hey, I'm willing to come alongside and to encourage and inspire. And so if there's one major takeaway from this podcast, if you're a young person listening to this, I want to encourage you to find a mentor. Find an adult that is willing to be an encouragement to you. And that might be a teacher, it might be a coach, it might be a youth pastor, it might be a youth leader. But open yourself up to that. You go back to my coach, and I've shared this before because I've had a gym. I ran a gym called KOI. You'll probably see me wearing T-shirts because I got so many of them. Knockout indie boxing. It was an amazing experience. So for 3 years, I would coach. And at one point, I had to explain to my group what it means to have a coach and a student relationship. You are wanting to be better. You have goals. And in the ADD world, that is hey, I want to figure out what accommodations I need to combat the neurological, disorder and the race car brain, or Ferrari brain, if you will, the impulsivity, all of those things. And so you go get a coach. And when you get a coach, what you are saying is, I am inviting you into my life to be that person who can speak truth, who can be harsh, who can coach. If you ever watch any really good sports movie, right now I'm thinking of the movie Miracle, where you've got the U.S. team and they had just barely beaten, some slacker hockey team, and the coach made him get on the line, and they had to do the back and forth over and over and over again. And then the movie, they did such a brilliant job. They're like, again. And one of the assistant coaches comes over to him and says, "Yeah, you're kind of borderlining on, insanity here." And he goes, again. And through that incredible struggle, that team actually became a team. But when you invite somebody in to be a coach, you're inviting that person to lift you up, challenge you, keep you accountable, but also to bust your butt when you need it. And if you're a young person and you don't have somebody like that in your life, and typically I'm going to say, hey, this needs to be an adult, find one. If you're an adult listening to this podcast, I want to encourage you to consider being one. A lot of times people get a little bit older and they're like, well, I don't really understand kids these days. And I heard that a lot when I worked at the church. I'm not really relevant. I'm not this, I'm not that. No, you don't understand. Just make yourself available. Everything else will take care of itself. Well, I'm not really prepared. I don't know enough. If you just make yourself available and you put yourself out there to be an encouragement, to share your stories, to look for opportunities, to inspire, to encourage, to correct. Did you hear that last part? To correct. Then you're making a difference. And it may start out with something small, like volunteering at a church with a youth group or something like that. Or, coming over to even one of the sports coaches, coaching Little League or something. Just put yourself in a position where you can take your years of experience and wisdom and say, hey, I am going to pour into a young person. And it may be something where you're in your 60s or 70s, your 80s, and you're pouring into a 20 or 30-year-old. But I guarantee you, if you take the time to do that, you will be incredibly blessed. And not only will it bless that individual that you're pouring into, it will also solidify these things for yourself. They will make them even more impactful in your life. Especially when you take the time to go back into your life and to see the individuals and to see the hurdles and the struggles and the challenges that you overcame. When you share that with somebody else, boy, it makes it more impactful in your own life, which is huge. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this podcast up. I told you guys I'm going to try to keep these right at around 40 minutes. This one is broaching 45, so I apologize. Hey, in the next podcast, I'm going to go ahead and dive into all of the stuff that I didn't get into this one, episode 2, Understanding ADHD. So for those of you that may know a bunch about ADHD, this will still be really good, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you some things that you can find online. All of this stuff is accessible. And then I'm going to just kind of give you my take on it. I'm going to give you the 80s ADHD guy's take on it based on my experiences, my stories, and the things that I've learned through my journey. And hopefully that'll be an encouragement to you guys. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. Please leave any comments per usual. Give it a follow so you don't miss any episodes. This is Ben Glenn signing out. As always, love, peace, and yes, my favorite, Lego bricks. God bless.